You're welcome to episode 29 of Folklore Fragments, the podcast from the National Folklore Collection, University College Dublin. Now, the National Folklore Collection is the successor body to the Irish Folklore Commission, that organisation which was tasked from the 1930s onwards of documenting the unwritten customs, beliefs and narratives of the Irish people. Those disiecta membra, as James Hamilton Delargy described them, of a rich heritage which it was feared was in danger of dying out and disappearing forever unless swift action was taken to gather up the fragments that remain lest they perish. Delargy and those with whom he worked endeavoured to secure for future generations the sources of inspiration and pride which had, as he wrote, for so long languished in the lumber room of history. Those tales, traditions and songs of Ireland he understood as representing the state papers of a forgotten and neglected people.
I realised that the old house was on fire, It was about time some of the furniture was taken out before the whole thing went up. In other words, a civilization which had lasted here, a Gaelic civilization which had lasted here for so many centuries, that now it was disintegrating. So that I suppose the desire to save, the urge to save, a burning urge to save. And I have done something in that regard, and I feel glad of that. But I feel sorry too, because I realise how little I have done, and how little we in the Irish folklore have done compared to what there was to be done.
The work of the Irish Folklore Commission then can be seen in ways to attempt to record the voices and ideals of the ordinary people of Ireland, to represent those communities whose voice was not heard among the formal archival records of the state. But there are silences in every archive, and the Irish Folklore Commission was no different, having its own particular biases and tendencies. Among these, for example, was an initial focus on the customs of rural people over those in towns and urban areas. And another, and one which is the subject of today's discussion, was the absence of material collected from Ireland's Protestant community. And thankfully, this has been recently addressed by Dr. Deirdre Nuttall, who is here with me today to discuss her new book, Different and the Same, A Folk History of the Protestants of Independent Ireland. So, Fáilte Isteach, welcome, Deirdre.
Thanks, Johnny.
So the book aims to partially address the stories of Protestants, especially non-elite Protestants, and to provide insight into the richness and counter-narratives embedded in Protestant stories. And so to this end, a project was initiated to document folk history of the Protestants of Independent Ireland, and as such, as part of that project, 98 interviews and 76 questionnaire responses from individuals all over Ireland were collected by Deirdre and by the NFC, by the National Folklore Collection, between 2013 and 2017. And many of their stories encompass their own parents' memories and therefore collectively form a folk history over the period from the start of the 20th century to recent times. Deirdre grew up on the outskirts of New Ross, County Wexford. She studied folklore and archaeology at UCD and took a master's degree in social anthropology at the University of Durham, and then returned to UCD to complete her PhD in folklore and ethnology, which explored migratory legends of the supernatural in the southeast of Ireland and Newfoundland. So, Deirdre, what is a Protestant? Is it a religious term or a cultural term?
Well, I would argue that in Ireland it's mostly a cultural term, and that refers to kind of a subgroup of Irish people. And obviously, faith is part of that. They belong to the Protestant denominations, or they're descended from people who belonged to the Protestant denominations.
Yep.
But the primary difference is it's kind of, they have a slightly different shared history and kind of a slightly different shared set of stories. So I would say in the Irish context, it's really a cultural group rather than strictly religious per se.
It's funny, like even the fact that, in a way you can leave religion, and to some extent, as you're right, you can leave a religion but still be seen as Protestant. It reminds me of the joke, are you Catholic or a Protestant? Like, I'm an atheist. Yeah, well, are you Catholic atheist or are you Protestant atheist? That you kind of, there's no escape from these identities or group identities. You mentioned in the introduction that there was a sense of decline, and a kind of that Protestants in Ireland represented a kind of a diminished or diminishing group. You're that throughout much of the 20th century, while wealthy Protestants remained influential, the Protestant community diminished. And you note that the departure of security forces and the disestablishment of British garrisons and other elements of the administration, kind of as they went with it, the relative fertility of the group fell below replacement level, and then factoring in immigration, which was at a higher rate than among the Catholic population, churches were abandoned, there was a certain narrowing of outlook. So there was a kind of, I suppose, a sense that the Protestant community in Ireland fell back on the defensive at the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, obviously throughout most of the colonial period, there were advantages to being a Protestant, particularly to being a member of the Church of Ireland, much less so if you were, Presbyterian or one of the smaller faith groups. And obviously that privilege wasn't evenly distributed, but there certainly would have been a sense of safety, probably, of having the same faith as the colonial government. And then, with independence, there's an inevitable backlash. It happens everywhere.
Yeah.
Where a new nation is finding its feet. So I think people really did go on the defensive. There was also kind of the surge of kind of Catholic triumphalism, which made people feel quite nervous as well. And really the communities became quite inward looking. The new Irish government treated wealthy Protestants really very well. They didn't want big business families to leave the country and take all their money with them. They were big employers. I mean, people like, the Guinness family, the Jacobs biscuit factory. These were people who employed a lot of people and were often seen as quite good employers. So the, kind of elite business families were treated extremely well by the new state. So you had the working class Protestants, lower middle class, smaller farmers, often really felt like they'd been very much left behind by everyone in the wake of Irish independence.
Yeah. One aspect at the start of the book that I thought was really interesting, that I thought it'd be worth looking at the start, would be maybe to examine some of the ideas around the folk and folklore collecting, particularly in the kind of late 19th century, and how that impacted, or kind of, I suppose, what the influence or impact was on the Protestant community. Like a lot of that in the 19th century, the folk were kind of conceived of as maybe Catholic, rural, illiterate, poor, and that there was a higher class or elite group who were educated, urban, and they don't correspond with that designation. And so, and yet a lot of the early scholars of folklore and collectors of folklore, either the literary figures like Lady Speranza Wilde, or Yeats, or Charlotte Brooke, or Charles Valency, that these were of an Anglo-Irish Protestant background themselves.
Well, people like Speranza Wilde and Yeats and other people in their group really, they felt very Irish. They considered themselves Irish. They were very aware of the privilege they had, and of course, Speranza's husband was a doctor, and also he was a very humanitarian doctor. So I think these people really were very aware of their privilege, and were also keenly aware of the importance of Irish folklore and how much there was there, and they, I think, felt that this was a way they could give back to their country, and they wanted to collect this material. They wanted to work with this material, make it available to a bigger audience. But at the same time, didn't feel that it belonged to them the same way it belonged to kind of people they were collecting from, either directly or indirectly. Yeah,
you're right here. For scholars such as Yeats and Wilde, collecting, publishing and treasuring oral lore of ordinary people could be a way of respecting them, but also of wishing to keep them in their place, and perhaps it was a useful way to express feelings about Protestants and Irishness without needing to discuss more challenging topics such as the plantation era and the strife that followed the Reformation.
Yeah.
I thought that was there's just an interesting kind of stress or something in that way. And then you go on to note about the establishment of the Folklore of Ireland Society in 1927, which Douglas Hyde, who again of an Anglo-Irish background, was a founder member, and also who established the Irish Folklore Commission with Delargy. He was kind of Delargy's mentor. That they were influenced by Romantic nationalism and the Gaelic revival, and that saw that the rural Irish culture kind of represented this ancient pure past, basically. And to that end, I suppose, in the early 20th century with the Commission, the schools collection was one folklore collecting initiative, a fantastic initiative really, that used school children, senior pupils all over Ireland, to collect folklore from their parents and grandparents. But there was a piece that you write, which I was just astonished by. I mean, I knew that there was a rural bias in the Commission at that time, and so urban areas are largely absent. They're conspicuous in their absence from the schools collection. But you note the case of a 9-year-old Samuel, one of the informants for the project.
Yeah.
That was just amazing. I'll read this piece from the book. It says, Samuel, 9 years old at the time of the school's collection, remembers how the material was collected in the Catholic primary school that he attended. When the teacher instructed the children to gather information from their parents and grandparents and the older people in the area for the Folklore Commission, they were all given special books to write the material in. He, however, was told that as a Protestant he was exempt from this homework. He was the only child who was not asked to gather folklore. Looking back, he says, the fact that the schoolmaster didn't think I should get something from his family strikes me now. And so in retrospect, he feels that this was because there was little interest in how Protestants lived in the 1930s. This idea that these are not the folk, as it were. This is not part and parcel of what it means to be Irish. I found that I was astonished by that.
Well, I was amazed and delighted to meet him at all, because obviously there aren't that many people left who took part, and he has actually passed away subsequently. But when I met him, I was kind of explaining why I was doing it. No, I remember that. He had a wonderful memory, and he remembers being told. And I have to stress that he had, while some Protestants who went to Catholic schools at that time don't have very happy memories of their education, he had very positive memories of his education. He was very happy in the Catholic school. There was no bullying. There was nothing unpleasant happened. He was very fond of his teacher. So this wasn't done in a nasty way. And at the time, he didn't experience it as an aggression at all. It was only subsequently he thought, why weren't they interested in us? Why didn't they? But I should stress that this view that Protestants didn't have folklore was not only held by people like Samuel's teacher, it was also held by the Protestants themselves, because it had become so ingrained, this idea that folklore belongs to Catholics, and especially poor Catholics, that it completely, it's actually something that will probably come up later on, is that I think this has actually been a great preserver of folklore among the Protestant community, because there's the idea that if a Protestant believes something, it's therefore definitionally not folklore, is really widely held.
Yeah.
So you'll often have people saying, they'll tell you a legend in beautiful detail, and then they'll say, well, I know it's true because my granddad was Protestant, and therefore he was an accurate, teller of this story.
Yeah, so, he wasn't superstitious.
Yeah. So, but I was so happy to meet Samuel and hear about this. And you just have to wonder then, did this happen a lot? Did the Protestant school teachers in the schools involved with school collection, were they maybe less interested in it because they felt it was less relevant to them? And certainly, I haven't done a detailed exploration between the Catholic and Protestant schools in the collection, but from what I've seen, the Protestant ones actually do look less interesting, and they do seem slightly more half-hearted, in that people were actually maybe slightly less interested in the project.
Yeah, it is interesting.
It's my impression.
Yeah, and it isn't. Sorry, go on.
Yeah.
Well, it
just would be an interesting project for someone to do at some point.
Definitely, yeah, and it is important to note as well, like you say, that it's not an explicit kind of act of like you said, aggression or something on the part of this teacher, but there are just blind spots and different perspectives that only become. They're conspicuous in their absence as time passes. It's like in the same way that the Urban Folklore Project, it was seen. Wait a minute, we haven't.
Yeah.
I mean, like I love Delargy's kind of wild quote in the foreword to the handbook, where he talks about the shoddy and imported culture of the towns that's pushing back the homespun courtesies and all that sort of stuff. That's all this kind of. I suppose fire and brimstone in a way kind of speak about the national importance of this scheme and so on, and yet I suppose, like you say, there are more complex feelings around identity and around the past for many Protestants in independent Ireland in particular. Like the collective memories of the majority were always encouraged to develop in a certain direction. That's always going to be the case, and it's only maybe when you stand in opposition to those kind of ideas or trajectories that you realise the force and strength of those currents that you're now contrary to in a way.
Yeah.
There's a section on that note about that the dominant narrative on the backbone of national identity kind of you write that often the Protestants don't fit neatly into the country's dominant narrative of a Catholic people long oppressed by a Protestant upper class who through heroic struggle achieved independence and the triumph of their faith, and the story of a people coming out of bondage that presents Irish history as a coherent ordering of events along a strict narrative line, serving as an intellectual and emotional backbone of national identity. So I suppose, you say as well, like in concluding the introduction, that for many people being Irish is intricately bound up with the Catholic Church, or nowadays with having rejected the Catholic Church. That's kind of part and parcel of for many of us who we are in a way, and that I suppose Protestantism in a sense falls outside of that narrative. Yeah,
and also I think because people like to think of stories as in terms of villains and heroes, and I think when we all learned history in primary school, we were taught about the landlords during the famine and blah blah blah, and the fact that the Protestants have always been socio-economically diverse is often, certainly at the level of popular discussions of history, completely overlooked. That Protestants could be small farmers, Protestants could live in tenements. Protestants weren't necessarily benefiting at all from sharing the fate of the infamous landlords. Is not something that was always filtered down to general knowledge. And that certainly still impacts on the way they are seen to this day, I would say, very much.
Yeah. There's a chapter, the first opening chapter on stories of origin I thought was really interesting, and particularly around these ideas of kind of, say, establishing the authenticity of your own claim to Irishness and so on, these collective stories. I thought it was fantastic, the early Protestant interest in St. Patrick and claiming him as St. Patrick's being the first Protestant and founding the Church of Ireland. Can you explain a bit about that, or what was the story there?
Well, this is actually it's quite an old idea. It started back in the 1700s with Bishop Usher, and so basically the Church of Ireland and also the Presbyterian Church laid claim to the idea of being the original Celtic Church of Ireland. Now, it makes no sense really, because obviously the Church of Ireland was an Anglican church, and therefore it was established by Henry VIII. So, it's really stretching it. but the idea was that that Patrick established true Christianity in Ireland, and that there are elements of truth insofar as Patrick, obviously, the Celtic Church in Ireland developed quite independently from the descent of the Powers Vatican for a long time. So they looked at that and they said, well, that was the true Christianity. And then in their reinterpretation of events, the Reformation, or the impact of the Reformation in Ireland, was the restoration of the true Celtic Church. And they kind of recast the Catholic Church as the interloper, and saying, oh, well, it was brought in by the Normans.
That's fantastic.
Well, it's pure folklore, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, but it's these questions of kind of claims to identity and authenticity, and again, just that question of communal memory and how do we stake our claim as a people in this place. The in-group, out-group kind of dynamic is. It also just shows how
powerful these mythological figures are. Now, I know Patrick was a real person, but he's also a mythological figure at the same time, and just how potent these symbols are to people that everyone wants a bit of it, and everyone wants to stake a claim to these great heroes of our history. Yeah.
There's you note as well, like one thing I thought was really, really striking, where you write, many ordinary Protestants have felt that they have been invited to assume a collective sense of shame for awful events in the distant past, such as the massacre by Oliver Cromwell in Drogheda in 1649, when the streets are said to have run red with blood, or the clearance of Catholics from their land to be replaced with planters. They have felt that they are expected to apologise for terrible things that some of their ancestors might have done long ago. In fact, many of them report having been explicitly told that they should be ashamed of what we are, because they are descended from the anti-heroes of Ireland's grand narrative. I was struck just by the deeply, I suppose, debilitating nature of that sort of discourse, these narratives of guilt, of shame, of self-abnegation. They all relate to questions of cultural affirmation, questions of group identity, questions of belonging, questions of history. They're the kind of the enemies that the people have to face within their own minds individually and as a group. And so with that in mind, like, how did Protestant communities in Ireland tell stories of their own origin to themselves, particularly around historical details, is about how they came to be in Ireland? How did they navigate those origin stories?
Well, a lot of people, I mean, when you start talking to them about their ancestors, will be very, very quick to say, oh, we came, shortly after Cromwell, and therefore we're nothing to do with him. Or, I mean, some people are much more explicit as well in discussing how they choose some stories to tell over others. So I think I quoted one man who said, I talk about my Quaker ancestors and I leave out the rest. I mean, things also changed, because if you look at the late 19th century and kind of popular writing among Irish Protestants, they were still feeling often quite proud about. I mean, the narrative then was that the yeomen had been good for Ireland, that they had introduced all this new blood, and that they'd introduced new ideas, and that people were proud of claiming descent, whether accurately or not, from them. But then with independent Ireland, people were like, oh, shit, we've got to, this is no longer okay, we can't be proud of these ancestors. Now we've got to find some other ancestors to be proud of. So when people would go to quite elaborate lengths, I mean, not entirely consciously, but just picking, and we all have hundreds and thousands of ancestors, so for all of us, deciding which ones we're going to discuss as our family history is, and there's an aspect of choice in it, clearly. So so people would say, oh, well, we are descended from the great Gaelic tribe of the O'Briens, and we're descended from Protestant nationalists, or we're descended from this, or we're descended from that. And I mean, stories that may well have been true or have big elements of truth, it's just that they would choose those stories in preference to other ones that might also have been true. I mean, it is actually an undeniable fact that many of the Protestants in Ireland today are descended from people who benefited in various ways from the plantation era. That's just a very uncomfortable truth that people kind of have to try and navigate through the stories they tell about their ancestors.
It's interesting, that question, kind of, in every remembering there's a forgetting as well. It goes back to the start of the archive and the kind of even Delargy's initial impulse to collect and to highlight the state papers of a forgotten people, and then setting up the folklore, the tradition archive, and then within that there are gaps and silences, and it just they're always there. Yeah, but you notice, or you note as well that some of the informants were mentioning a certain sense of shame of their ancestors, and you write that
some of them would be quite explicit about it. I'm ashamed of who I am. I'm ashamed of being descended from Protestants.
Yeah, it's awful.
I try not to tell people. Yeah. I
can't imagine. It's just a deeply debilitating, or such a negative impact on people's self-identity, that sort of discourse or that kind of trajectory, whatever. But you notice that humble ancestors are easy to discuss, the Huguenots and Palatines and so on.
Yeah.
And you note then that some individuals say, oh, my ancestor came over to Ireland as an orphan with their sister, or oh, my ancestor came over to build a school, or they were stonemasons or farmers, so that people were very, very aware of their own family histories and how to navigate them privately and publicly, I suppose.
Yeah. And which stories you might discuss only at home and which you might tell your friends.
Yeah, what do you ventilate and when? Yeah. It's I suppose, to move then towards the question of stories of the past, I thought it was really interesting because there are so many approaches to the kind of the grand historical events of Irish history, and in a way, I suppose, they have to be navigated in their own kind of, I suppose, deft or careful way. You write here, all peoples tell stories about the past that appear to make sense of the present and provide a narrative that flows logically from the beginning to the current status quo or the end. The past becomes a screen onto which different groups can interpret their own understanding. It is important to record these stories from every element of a population, otherwise we lose one or more of our windows into the past, and an important factor in understanding the present. Informal histories are subjective, but formal histories can be too, which I thought was a great observation. So, I suppose, how did Protestants in Ireland tell themselves stories about important historical periods like 1798, say?
Well, they kind of, depending on where they're from and what emphasis they want to give, I mean, they would often stress, if they had a nationalist ancestor, that would, in independent Ireland, have been the thing to discuss, or they would kind of try to tone things down, or they would sometimes try to point out that things could not always be as black and white as they're often thought to be. So I think one of the examples I discussed in there was a lady who had been told at school that the famine was done to the Catholics by the Protestants, and she had heard stories at home from like her grandparents or whatever that the Protestant community locally had been devastated in the famine. So it was in an area where there was a big kind of cohort of Protestants with very small farms. And the stories that they had heard, they had been shown as abandoned cottages, long abandoned cottages, obviously, and told that's where people used to live. They all died in the famine, or they all emigrated. So she had told her teacher, "Oh, in my village, lots of people died, or lots of people emigrated." And he said, "Nonsense. The famine was done to the Catholics by the Protestants. That's not true." So she was felt quite chastened, and it wasn't until many years later she was in the local historical society lecture, and a historian from Dublin told her, yes, actually the famine affected poor people, didn't really care, what kind of cultural identity those people had. And so that was kind of the kind of complexity of just looking at history and how it can be much more nuanced than people often think.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, in particular, thinking about the famine like as a traumatic event in the national psyche, but it speaks to the nature of communal memory as a way of relating to a past that we didn't experience, but again, like that it's one that we navigate today and by which we are oriented. You write in the book as well, like it suited Catholics and Protestants alike to characterise the famine as a Catholic problem. For Catholics, it was proof that the British state did not care about them. Britain had given extraordinary powers to absentee landlords and failed to deliver effective disaster relief. For Protestants, it seemed to show the superiority of their society and its work ethic, and even suggested that God was casting judgment on an indolent and unself-reliant people. But then you note as well how some Protestants felt that they were being pilloried unfairly in these narratives, and around the big house narratives in particular, where the kind of those with land and that big house demographic, as it were. You write of Esther, who writes, or who says, Bord Fáilte, which is the Irish Tourism Authority, in their campaign of the ancient East, appeared to suggest that all big houses caused hardship to their tenants and employees or were absentee landlords. This was not so. My great-grandmother contracted typhoid as a result of manning soup kitchens. She never properly recovered and died early as a result. It has been said that the Protestants forced the starving Catholics to change their religion. I do not have any evidence of this. So,
yeah,
I suppose there's a kind of, like you say, these narratives that are inherited and that are navigated to this day, but where there are clear black and white heroes and anti-heroes. But of course, when you begin to unpick it and take it apart, the history is actually much more nuanced and unclear.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually interesting. During the famine, some of the church leaders, I suppose, really said awful things, and kind of further cemented the idea in the minds of the Protestants that superstitiousness was a Catholic trait, and suggested that God's wrath was being visited upon the superstitious masses. I mean, really helping to just drive a wedge between people. I mean, saying such awful things like that while people were dying in such vast numbers, and effectively blaming having a fondness for folklore on their horrible death. Yeah.
It's I mean, there's a number of these, like, and it's just interesting to look at the angles that you bring up in this question, stories of the past. Like, the First World War as well, how that there were more proportionally there were more Protestants that were sent to the front, basically, that you're right. By late 1915, there were about 53,000 Irish Protestants and 80,000 Irish Catholics fighting on the British side. And in 1917, when 150,000 were enlisted, 60,000 were Protestant and 90,000 were Catholics. These figures refer to the whole island and indicate that while Protestants represented about a quarter of the total population, they contributed about 40% of the soldiers. But you noted then as well that there is a sense of kind of betrayal and poor treatment, that, some of them, following their return from the front, that many Protestant young men, that they wouldn't stand up in church for God Save the King when they came back, that they felt they'd been treated badly by England.
When I was a boy, they used to have a parade on Armistice, called Armistice Day in November.
Yeah.
And Roman Catholics and everything, but there were an awful lot of Roman Catholic soldiers and
of course, yeah.
All the back streets,
yeah,
had Union Jacks out.
Really?
For VE Day.
Yeah, that'd be the local Catholic community.
The Catholic community.
Yeah.
That all Holborn Street was a mass of Union Jacks.
Because they'd all lost lost sons and brothers.
Yeah. Because 1914-18, we were all one.
And they didn't realise how bad it was going to be, did they? No.
They were just sent out to be slaughtered.
Yeah.
It was, it was the old ascendancy. Send them out.
They didn't care. Yeah.
They did. They felt they'd been abandoned by England, and they increasingly also felt that they had been abandoned by the Irish Free State. That they were being, considered traitors when they thought they had. I mean, it's the same as the Catholic soldiers. They had thought they were doing the right thing at the time, and then they felt embarrassed, ashamed, let down. Yeah, I mean, it did have a devastating effect on many Protestant families, because it's just most families, or many families, would have had someone who went off and died, and then not being able to, or not really knowing how to memorialise them, because it became a bit awkward and embarrassing quite quickly.
Yeah.
And not really being able to talk about it.
And you note in 1916 as well, like you talk about, again, this kind of ambivalence, or the aftermath of 1916. You're out of Barney, who I thought he just used really interesting language that was used when he talks about his recent ancestors who were living in a border area and how they reacted to 1916, the rising. And he says, there was nobody as close, that is the Protestant families or community. We had to pull together when you were in a strange land with a different religion. And he mentioned a strange land several occasions.
Yeah. Now, it's striking that that's a border area, because the experience of the border areas would be quite different than in other parts of Ireland.
Yeah.
That they, their numbers were bigger for a start. There were more Protestants proportionately, so it was easier for them to just kind of stick within their own group. There were also much bigger kind of cohort of small farmers, working class Protestants. So the majority of these people would not have been elite people, or far from it. You know, they wouldn't have been even shopkeepers. They would have been people, you know, working very hard for a very basic standard of living. So, I mean, the border experience is definitely a particular one. I mean, they would have been culturally much more aligned with people who ended up on the northern side of the border, and would have had much more sense of being abandoned in a strange land than people a bit further south, who would have been much more integrated into their communities typically.
I want to play just a piece of audio here. This is from the Urban Folklore Project. This was recorded in May 1980, and it's Seamus McPhilip talking to Louis Powderly, who's an inner city working class Dublin Protestant from a Protestant background. Seamus is kind of trying to ask him, after he describes the looting and specifics of the day, he's like, well, you know, were you sorry to see the British pull out of the South? And he's basically kind of cagey about it, but I get a sense that there's more there, but he's kind of holding back to a certain extent, that he doesn't quite he's just not entirely prepared to express how he feels totally about it.
Do you remember the 1916 Rising, don't you?
Oh, didn't I do?
What did you think of that when it happened? Of course, you were fairly...
I was 16 at the time.
What did you think of the rebels?
Oh, well, I didn't think much of them, because at the time the war was on and everybody was talking about the war, and a lot of people were saying it was a shame to start trouble here and the war on and all that.
Were you sort of sorry to see the British pull out of the South in 1920?
Of course I hadn't the experience.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of people were very sorry to leave them, see them leaving.
Yeah. And you might have been yourself, well, you had been a British soldier. So.
Yeah, I was sorry to see them, because there's no use going over that sort of thing now. It's over and done with.
You think it might have been a better country if they'd stayed, maybe?
No, I think it would be.
Yeah.
But see, now they've sold the country over to the what you call it, the common market.
Yeah.
And you've got to do what they say.
And your parents didn't want you to join the army, so did you run away or something?
No, they didn't.
Did they know you were joining?
Oh, I just came home and said it, and I joined the army, and that was all right.
And that too, when you joined, it was after the Rising. So, the Irish struggle was just beginning and so on. But yet, you didn't... You hadn't been brought around to the rebel cause, right?
Oh, no, because all my family, they were all... We weren't mixed up in that sort of thing at all.
Yeah. You never really sympathised with Republican
politics,
did you?
No. As a matter of fact, I didn't take any interest in them, because I was always brought up, always never to get into any trouble.
There's another piece I want to play here. A fantastic character, Lieutenant Colonel O'Connell Fitzsimons, and he describes he grew up in Glencullen in County Dublin, and he describes similarly the Rising. And from his house, he was sent with hay. He was told that the British horses in the RDS needed hay, and so he was sent off to through the city to send it. And he had a kind of a fantastic adventure with a mate of his, basically, as they saw it. But also expresses a kind of, I suppose, he talks about the wicked stupidity of the English because of the execution. So again, there's a kind of just an interesting crossover. I'll just play this piece now.
Yeah.
You weren't in Ireland when the 1916 Rising happened, were you?
Oh, yes.
Were you?
I was going for a crammers then in Dawson Street for the Sandhurst exam. It was great fun, that.
The Rising?
Yeah. That's what we thought. I mean, young youngster like myself. It was Easter Monday, wasn't it? Yes. I'd been out all day on a motorbicycle, a trial run, down to, we had lunch with this group of motorists in the waters there. Arrived back home about 4 o'clock. Home was then Maureen. Cousin Tom rang up to say the party's off for tonight. There's trouble in the town. I don't know what it is. He said it's a shooting going on. You can hear it in the telephone maybe to my father. But it seems to be serious, more than a strike. So my father came. I was just finished dressing, and he said, "You better not go in." So I had dinner at home, and afterwards I got on the motorbike and rode in to see what was to do. I went in by Ranelagh to Charlemont Bridge, but I was stopped by a British soldier who held up his hand and his rifle in the other, bayonet not fixed, which it should have been, and he said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I've come in to see what's to do." "Do you know?" He said, "No, I'm here to stop everybody going into the city. There's trouble in there." And I should have said, "You're telling me," because it was noise, really. It was quite loud then. Long bursts of fire. So I went on up to the other one, the Charlemont Bridge. The other one, Portobello. The same thing happened, and I said, "Well, damn it," and I went and drove home. Then it was the following night that we walked up to the top of the hill, to the turret, as they called it, could see the blaze. But the next day, we discussed this business for a long time. And while we had a discussion after breakfast the next morning, Hugh Gillett, who lived next door in Clonard, came walking up the avenue, and he said, "Oh, there you are, Manners." Manners is my name. "There you are, Manners. I've just been told that a fodder is needed for the British horses that are being stabled in the RDS grounds." And my father said, "Who told you?" And he mentioned the name of the man whose name I don't remember, but he lived in Kilgovan. And I'm going to go in now and see what I can do about it. We haven't got enough. And he turned to my father, "Have you any hay you could spare?" And Peter said, "Neither hay nor roads at all." So anyway, Hugh came back about half an hour afterwards, and he said, I got into the sidecar, and he said, "We'll go out through Blanchard. Do you know the countryside? Blanchard's town, Trunee, after Blanchard's Mulhudder. I'm going out to Mulhudder now, I believe. Can't remember the name of the people that lived there. They were an old family. They migrated what was left of them to Australia, to New Zealand some years ago, to see if they've got any hay. So off we started. We went into the RDS, found a quartermaster fellow there, asked what was wanted, and he said, "All we can get." They had been in a station there for some considerable time, the transport horses, and not as cavalry. He says, "We don't know how long we'll be here, so we better get all you can, at least order it." So off we went from the RDS along Pembroke Road, and heard a nasty piece of shooting going on. And Hugh, having more sense than I said, "I'm going back. I'm not going to go up across there and down Bagot Street over the canal." He said, "We'll go on round. We'll go round by what's the bridge above King's Bridge? It's a couple of miles up.
The Island Bridge. Island Bridge.
Island Bridge, yes. We go round by Island Bridge and through the park. So we did, expecting to be shot at or to be chased. and shouted and sang to us. Arrived in Mulhot in, I wish I could remember the name of these people. One of them was in the Leinsters with me. Anyway, we got there and we had chat and tea, and I found that we could get 4 or 5 loads of hay if the wagons were sent for it. And rode back to Ballsbridge. Hugh reported what had happened. I confirmed it. And we both shook hands with each other and said, "We're heroes. Let's go home to lunch." It was a great little adventure. Terrific. That's about all I know.
What did you think, you and your family think of the rebels?
We didn't know what to think. We didn't know what to think. We argued and argued. We didn't feel frightened or anything like that. We didn't, wasn't a question of closing the shutters and locking the doors. But we wondered what the aftermath would be. My father, of course, was particularly bothered. But I was only a schoolboy at the time, you see. And it was all rather fun. But it sank into me within a day or so when people in Sandyford came over to see if anything could be done about getting flour. Because most of them baked their bread in those days, although they did live near Dundrum and the city. So a flour pool was made in the coach house in Marine. But a few step in a week and all was over. That's all we thought about it at all. Much impressed by the ruins of Sackville Street when we did go in. No sign of blood, no dead bodies, very disappointing. The reaction of a very, very young and not very brilliant person.
What did you think of the executions afterwards?
A pity. A pity, it'll lead to trouble. And later on realised it was stupidity, wicked stupidity, typical of the mentality of the English.
And soon afterwards...
They don't hang people right, left, and nowadays, right, left and centre. They thrash them, knock them about, treat them badly and lock them up. Let them out. Some have learnt the lesson, some haven't. Yet you're going to say what?
Then soon afterwards you went to Sandhurst and you became an officer. And then did you go to France then, was it? Did you see action during the war?
Yeah.
In
France.
In the trenches?
Yeah. Very cold and very wet. Very nasty.
So I suppose, these kind of large-scale historic events really, the next huge one really is the War of Independence or the Civil War. I mean, the Irish War of Independence occurred between 1919 and 1921, and it ended with the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which led to the partition of Ireland into 2 separate states, the Free State, the Irish Free State, so-called, and Northern Ireland. And then by June 1922, the Free State entered into a state of civil war over the question of partition. But during that period, you note that increasingly that the Catholic community looked on their Protestant neighbours increasingly as a separate ethnicity, kind of. Is that true? Yeah,
in fact, it became increasingly common to refer to them as English, which they did not appreciate. It was considered a grave insult, really, to be called English. They were increasingly being seen as representing England. As opposed to another type of Irish person, which is, I think, how the majority of them would have seen themselves as being Irish, but a bit different.
I remember, it kind of ties in with the conversation that I mentioned to you briefly before about, I was chatting to somebody about this project, how it was ongoing, and he became quite irate. He described that same sense of his family having been living in a part of Wicklow for kind of hundreds of years, for generation after generation, but still having this sense of not being fully accepted as Irish by Catholics, in particular by his own kind of Catholic contemporaries or friends or whatever. So I think that's a thing that cuts quite deeply in a way, but it's a wound, or the scar tissue isn't always seen, you know what I mean? It's not again, these things aren't necessarily shown, but
And how did people feel about the treatment of the Protestant community by the government? Was there a sense of discrimination, or were people generally happy?
A sense of discrimination, a resentment on the part of many of being forced to learn Irish.
Really?
A sense of living in a cold house as Protestant people, especially people that had relatives in the forces, like my own uncle, my mother's brother, and his son. They were both in the RAF.
There was one account which I thought was quite kind of distressing in a way, just how the fault lines can run straight through a community. This is around the time of the Civil War, or the War of Independence and so on. You write, my grandfather was this is from Hope, and it's described here. My grandfather was a justice of the peace, and he'd been a hunting and shooting man and farmer. He was coming back across the fields, and he disturbed a group of the rebel army practicing or manoeuvring or something. Later on, he was seen going into the army barracks in the town, and then a while later, a number of them were arrested, and it was presumed that he had reported on them, but my father and his brother certainly said no, that he didn't. My father was there the first time the RA came out. My grandfather was told he must leave immediately. They were going to execute him. And one of the men apparently spoke up, and that upset my grandfather very much, because when he spoke up, he realised that he knew who he was. Their faces were all blacked, and I think that they were all masked. I've always just heard about their black faces. And they came right into the house and right into her bedroom, and he was brought out and put up against the wall, the kitchen wall of the house, apparently, and the children were all told to stay on the stairs in the centre of the house. Houses had been put on fire, and they were afraid this might happen. And my father described it, that looking down from the window, once the man spoke up, they said, well, he could leave, but he had to leave immediately. And then they blackmailed the family. They had to leave money in a certain place down in the wood, and they got sort of orders to do this every so often, and they didn't have much money at the time. You're just thinking to yourself, even just the horror of kind of recognising this voice of one of your neighbours from behind this mask, who's standing in your kitchen with your bloody children holed up on the staircase, and people in fear of their lives,
Yeah, and that's just, I actually heard many variations on that story. These things happened a lot. And also kind of afterwards, these people were still your neighbours, and you had to, you had to go on doing the dressing with them and sharing a horse or doing the creamery run together. Because, often, until certainly the 1960s, 1970s, rural work was, depended a lot on cooperation between neighbours, between farmers.
Yeah.
So things settle down, and you'll be again, so we do the creamery run together. Shall we share a combine harvester? And this terrible thing would have happened between you. So, that was a trauma that took a long time to work out. And what a lot of people said was, when I was going around talking to people, was that this story had been in the family, but they only started talking about it in the last 10 to 15 years when the last people who could remember it personally died. Yeah. Because it was just so upsetting. Because it was just...
Well, there's so much pain there, and it's something that you see in tradition often, that these fault lines in the kind of communal consciousness or memory, that they, like the Civil War, the famine and so on, that they don't enter into folk tradition, they don't appear on the surface until a generation or two kind of goes by. Because, like you said, they're just too painful to talk about. I can't imagine that. There's one piece that I just thought was really metaphoric or symbolic of so much at a personal and communal level, where you write, you note here a fellow Thomas, and it says here that Thomas's uncle during the War of Independence was in the forces against the insurgency, that is, against the rebels. Afterwards, he hid his ammunition by burying it underneath an apple tree. Gradually, the lead from the ammunition leached into the soil and killed the tree. Its steady decline was a constant reminder of the secret underneath it. The corresponding rifle stayed in the attic of the old family home until the 1990s. I just thought it was a kind of... There's a beautiful or sad statement, I suppose, to that.
It's like the kind of Jack and Barry novel or something.
Yeah, it's like those secrets that we bury within ourselves, that, that on the surface of things the tree looks normal, and yet it's wilting and dying because this thing hasn't been extricated. There's something kind of buried within, at an individual and a communal level. The secret hasn't been voiced or spoken, and so it's affecting things on the surface. The tree is kind of withering and dying, but if to look at it, no one would know why. Again, like what are the secrets or stories, or what are the aspects of our past, or that the community and that the individual kind of denies and buries within themselves, whatever. But there are many harrowing accounts in that sense, and I can't imagine, I suppose, like you said, the pain that has only been recently begun to be discussed. To move on to there's the next kind of section, which is a really interesting chapter on stories of identity, loyalty and culture. I suppose as part of this, there's a sense of a kind of a lingering or a quiet affinity with Britain among many of the Protestant community, and particularly maybe some of the older Protestant communities or the memories that you were collecting. So how did Southern Protestants navigate their affinity with Britain while in Ireland?
Well, in many cases by rejecting it quite vociferously as time passed. So there's some stories about families being very pragmatic, and there's one gentleman who said, well, as soon as Ireland became independent, we added, I don't remember if it was an O or a Mac, but they Gaelicised their name above the top door. And other people, I mean, some people actually remembered or had heard stories of their parents remembering more likely being kind of gathered together and said that this is a new situation, so we're all going to stop doing this and now we're going to start doing this other thing. So people, I mean, one lady remembered, and this would have been afterwards, like some decades after independence, but there's kind of solemn moments when a picture of Queen Alexandra was taken off the wall in the living room and the picture of the Fine Gael cabinet was put up instead.
Yeah, I remember that. I laughed at that. Yeah.
Or, kind of different symbols of identity being removed and replaced with other more nationalist symbols.
My mother's family called me the Protestant nationalist.
Oh, why did they call you that?
Oh, because I was more anti-British.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say anti-British, but I was more nationalist.
Yeah.
In outlook.
So that would have been the 50s, would it, when you?
That was in the 40s.
40s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was born in 1930.
Right.
And I'm not sure why I always figured England were milking Ireland.
There's those interesting questions about like the portraits that are put up, or days that are important. There's a piece here you note, Myrtle describing the visits to the family farm every Sunday in the 1950s. And she says that at the time they were still clinging to their unionist ideals. She viewed the portraits of King George and Queen Mary on the living room wall as a testament to the family's ongoing loyalist sensibilities. And then another woman, Doris's father, continued to consider the English king as the bee's knees, that is to say, he was a great chap altogether, throughout her childhood. Remembrance Day was significant in her family and in her school, and she remembers listening to the Remembrance Day service and the King's speech in London on the wireless and having to stand for the British national anthem. Imagine that, she says today. This topic of the king, there's another fantastic piece of audio. This is recorded by yourself and Chris. This woman is describing the first time she remembers crying. And she was 6 years old, and it was when the king died, and when she'd heard that the king was dead, basically she became upset.
Would there be strongly unionist there?
Well, my father, I never heard him talking much about it, but I think he would have. He'd been Fine Gael anyway.
Yeah.
He certainly wouldn't be a Fianna Fáil.
Fianna Fáil, he wouldn't be on the Republican side.
No.
Yeah.
And most of the Protestants were unions. The traces of unionism was there.
Yeah, like my dad, my uncle that brought me up then. I mean, he was a fierce loyalist and he was quite bigoted against the Catholic faith. Maybe he was against the Protestant faith as well because circumstances and that. But he would have had cousin used to send him newspapers from England and he'd have them on the wall like plaster. He used it as wallpaper in the old kitchen.
Yeah.
Pictures of the Queen and the King and all the rest of it. And I know the first time I remember crying, I should come in here maybe.
Of course you can.
But the first time I remember crying was when I was 6, when the King died, and I heard it on the radio. And I went running up the road to tell my dad that the King had died. I mean, the King had died. And that's the first time I ever remember crying.
Was he upset as well?
I don't know, but I was. I mean, the King, because they were just a magic people to me. But anyway, I shouldn't have put it in there. Sorry.
I thought that was fantastic. That description, where she says, "Oh, they were just a magic people to me." That question, and yet there was also a sense of having been deserted by Britain. You write as well, from one of the informants and the interviewees in the project. Well, it says in my mother's passport, these children are not British subjects. So we were aware from an early age that we were not British subjects. And I think my father was quite happy with that. What had the Crown ever done for him? But I think he had a sense of exile, having been so close to the British time, having been born in the British time himself, and grandfather having died for King and Empire, and King and Empire having then deserted them. So there's a kind of sense of a certain split in the community, in the minds of many, around this a sense of identity, but a sense of maybe being kind of deserted or then increasingly surrounded and under siege. And then you note that the generations of people who came after their parents, that they had quite a different perspective, that they didn't have the same there's a sense of, I question myself, like, this is another piece, what did England do for the Protestants or for the whole of Ireland? I don't think they were really interested in Ireland, yet I question why did the likes of my parents want to be looking to England? Because they were doing nothing for them. Most people in our inner city area were poor, whether you were Protestant or Roman Catholic. In fact, maybe in some cases the Roman Catholics could have been a lot better off. I think the Protestants at that stage looked to Britain, even though Britain didn't give a twopenny ticket about Ireland. So there's a sense of like, look, you've been abandoned, basically. These people don't care about you, and neither does the Free State doesn't care about you either. There's a sense of, I suppose, being being exiled in that way.
Yeah, I think that was particularly strong maybe among inner city Protestants who really, they did genuinely have a hard time. They had no resources to fall back on like wealthy Protestants. They were poor. Really, for a lot of them, all they had was a strong sense of identity. So I think they were probably the most likely to cling to this sense of Britishness long after other people had kind of given up on it. Because, they didn't really have very much in terms of material resources. So, obtaining some sort of a sense of identity or pride from a counter-identity maybe was a source of personal strength for that particular group. I think it was much easier for maybe more moneyed Protestants or for people with land to get identity from their business enterprise or from being farmers or whatever. But I really think that some of the most interesting stories you hear are from inner city Protestants in Dublin. They're a fascinating group, and they haven't had a very easy time. They were also quite substantially abandoned by more affluent Protestants who just didn't really want anything to do with them.
To do them either. Yeah. So, I thought it was interesting. One of the kind of signifiers that went totally over my head, I don't know if it's still around today at all, was the presence of a little statuettes of white horses in inner city flats, and which signified the house as a Protestant house, because it's in commemoration to King Billy and the Battle of the Boyne. Yeah,
but apparently, most people didn't know that. It was like kind of an
I thought that was amazing.
Message. I wasn't aware of it either. And I actually have seen a couple, I think on Dorset Street, and I thought, I wonder if that's what that is.
Yeah.
It could just be a horse. Yeah.
There's another question, I suppose, that you raised, which I thought was fascinating, and it's the idea, you touched on it earlier already, and the idea of Protestants and the rejection of folk tradition, or the rejection of tradition. And I suppose you give a couple of examples that for some Protestants, Gaelic culture and tradition were to be avoided. I thought this was hilarious. There's a quote from the provost of Trinity College, which is then associated heavily, obviously, with the Anglo-Irish gentry. He stated that old Irish literature was degenerate and filthy, and that Irish folklore was at bottom abominable. It's kind of, tell me what you really think. I thought that was a fantastic quote. So he's obviously having none of it. And there's a sense that you note about, fairy stories and things were not allowed in our house. My mother was very particular about nonsense, is one of the quotes. Some people looked on tradition as pagan customs handed down by the Druids, and they didn't want anything to do with any sort of superstition and so on. So I thought that was really interesting. I laughed as well about, this woman, Hope, I think, is describing how traditional music really wasn't allowed on the radio, and they'd say, turn off that old jiggity jog, that kind of nonsense. So there's nonsense and kind of superstitions are kind of to be avoided. And yet, again, when you go beneath the surface, there's a kind of attention to that, like that actually there were beliefs in the Banshee or in traditional forms of healing and so on. So how does that manifest itself?
Well, that was actually one of the most interesting things, that these people, not everyone, but some people would make these quite strong statements that, step back a little bit, folklore was used by people like De Valera as a tool in nation building, and so it was kind of used in a way that promoted the idea that Gaelic culture and Gaelic folklore was kind of the true Ireland and that everyone should aspire to. So anyone who didn't like De Valera or his political kind of stance might be inclined to feel a bit hostile towards it because of that.
Mm-hmm.
But these kind of actual, fairly explicit expressions of hostility have the flimsiest to no relationship at all with people's actual behaviours. So if you were to just ask, oh, is there any folklore or tradition in this family? People go, oh no, not at all. But if you say something else, if you say, well, would your parents, your grandparents have had any belief in fantasy? Would they have gone to the Holy Well? Would they have done this? Would they have done that? Oh yes, of course.
Yeah.
They would have done that.
I know my father had the cure of the sprain, and it was a cure that was handed down in the family from male to female and from female to male. It was a Protestant man that first gave it to his mother, my grandmother, when she was a little girl. He was brought to the farm to make the cure of the sprain for a cow that had hurt her foot. And he made it, and he said he had to come a long journey, and he said, I give it now, he said, to the little girl, and she can cure. So he did, and it has something to do with the proper placing of your hands on the joint that's injured. I'm saying some prayers. Any prayers, I think. My father would say an Our Father and a Hail Mary, but possibly there is maybe a special prayer to be said.
That you mentioned Holy Wells. I thought there was a brilliant entry in the book on Holy Wells. Doris, and you write that Doris and her husband were invited to an event at a local Holy Well. Although this was un-Protestant, they went and it was grand. They said that they prayed with the rest of them and all. It seems that there was a certain amount of thrill in transgressing a social norm. Many Protestants seem to feel or have felt that attending rites at Holy Wells is not suitable for them. But this is one of the most persistent aspects of folk religion in Ireland, and often the rites and rituals have the flimsiest of relationships with official Catholic doctrine. For rural people, activities involving a local holy well can mean many things. They have an important religious element, often with roots in pre-Christian tradition, but they are also territorial rites associated with place, community and belonging. Moreover, the meaning of a sacred space in the landscape can change and shift, or can be different to different people. By participating in rites rooted in the local landscape, even if they are usually associated with the other sort, one can convey the message that we belong here too. I thought that was really interesting, the idea that, even the pre-Christian sense of some of these the holy wells and celebrations that, like you say, have no bearing off into the former Catholic Church or are actively looked down on by the Church, that if you kind of scrape beneath the layers of Christian inheritance down, we can maybe reconnect with other modes of expression which go beyond Christian sectarianism, say. But I just thought that was interesting. It kind of made me smile, the sense of this, the transgressive quality of visiting a holy well, which I just never experienced, I'd never thought of before. You mentioned some calendar customs as well, and some which I wasn't familiar with at all. What was beating the bounds?
Beating the bounds was you would go around the parish boundary, and I think originally you would kind of hit it with a child, like you would kind of pick up a little boy and kind of pass him along the boundary, but or later on they would use sticks. It was another territorial right, really, just marking out the community boundaries. Right, okay, this is our land, essentially. Yeah, that we belong here, and kind of keeping it safe for the next year, and Yeah. And then you mentioned other aspects of which I thought was interesting, visual symbols, like wearing the poppy, and that in the absence of the visual iconography, which is central to a Catholic home, that in some places there was signs of kind of cultural pride among Protestants, where they wear the poppy, and sometimes in their breast pocket they put a razor there, so that if anyone tried to snatch the poppy off them in the street, that their fingers would be cut by this razor blade. Now, this may well be an apocryphal story, but it certainly is a story that was told, yeah. So I suppose, how is that, there's certain questions of cultural pride among Protestants as well, like that they were maybe more free thinking or hard workers or trusted or had a sense of civic responsibility and thriftiness and so on, and that was often told by Catholics as well, wasn't it? Yeah, they're very clean. They're very so some of them read about quite little things, like people say they know more about free things. They know how to make nettle soup, they know how to make jelly out of rose hips, and they would be more food. It comes up quite a lot that people would say they're very good at making a meal out of nothing, that they're very good at foraging in the hedgerows, that they it's lots of little things that people would mention as sources of cultural pride, and food would definitely come up quite a lot.
I thought it was interesting, the sense of being kind of free thinkers, and some of them feeling that their Catholic neighbours were kind of, under the thumb or duped by the church. And yet there's a certain contradiction maybe in some sense, in that, there was the experience of Nay Temery and the idea of the Protestant population being declined by mixed marriages and the huge strain that put on families, and then the pressure that was put on certain Protestant individuals not to engage in mixed marriages and to maintain a kind of in-group cohesion, where on the one hand there's a sense of, yes, we are free thinkers and not slaves to tradition, and yet there were many, then there was a sense of a kind of sorrow at maybe missed opportunities in life, and people who never got to marry and so on because of those pressures that were applied to them.
Yeah.
What was Nay Temery, or what was the...
Nay Temery was a rule passed in 1908 that said that if a Catholic person married someone who wasn't Catholic, they had to bring the children up as Catholics. So this particular law, the Irish state really got behind it sort of afterwards in early independence, and so this rule, which obviously applied, it was a Vatican ruling, so it obviously applied everywhere among Catholics, but it was applied with incredible ferocity in Ireland, and even kind of got mixed up sometimes in actual kind of civil legal cases and stuff where the state would roll in behind it. So people were extremely anxious about that, for sure, and then really did not react very pragmatically. They really tended to react, very strongly, counter-react against it, and it was a big factor in influencing Protestant communities to really turn inward and to be kind of agents of their own marginalisation in some cases, so that a lot of the sense of marginalisation that small Protestant communities would express, I mean, partly it came from the situation that they were in as a minority, but it also came from their own kind of collective decision to turn their backs around and kind of circle the wagons a bit. And a lot of that was around marriage, these laws to do with marriage.
And were there many Protestants around that area near?
Well, now where I'm living at the moment, there was no one else years ago was let into those buildings, only Protestants. Now we've only one Protestant out of that generation here.
Yeah. And was there any antagonism towards them?
Oh no. No. Oh no, because when I was a young one, there was I lived in Francis Street where O'Hara is now. There's a row of cottages there where the Corrigate is. And we lived down there, and then we moved up to the drawing room over O'Hara's. And it was a double hall, 6 and 7, and there was a little shop between. Now O'Hara's has the whole lot now. And there was a family, the name of Proctor, lived in what we call a parlour, but it was a shop, but they used to come into the yard and go round by the back. And that young one, I brought her into the church several times. They were rank Protestants, and I brought them into the church several times, and she loved it. I suppose I wouldn't know the young one now, but all my people were Protestants. And my mother converted them. And his mother and father, my grandmother and my grandfather died rank Protestants. But they never, they ignored my mother. Now the grandfather didn't, but the grandmother, she always addressed the others as Kate Jackson and all to this, Jackson was her name before I was married. But she'd always call my mother Mary Mooney by her maiden name. Over that.
There was one aspect, a certain kind of sadness, I thought, you noted in the introduction to the book, that kind of as the calendar observances become less important, in an age of increased homogenization, globalization, secularism, that as these defining characteristics kind of fade away, that they can begin to be discussed in a sense, like you kind of, in concluding the book, you note at the end, Protestant cultural integration is increasingly the status quo. For older people who can remember when life as an indigenous minority in Ireland was much more complicated than it is today, this reality can give rise to a complex blend of shame and pride. Shame in having failed to assert a sense of cultural difference that is valued, and pride in making the pragmatic decision to relinquish many of the behaviours, traditions and even shared memories that once made them unique for the sake of harmony and integration. However, for Protestants, Ireland's tendency towards secularism impacts on their cultural identity in a particular way. The Protestant who drifts away from their religious identity also drifts away from their community's traditions and shared memories. It is hard to avoid the conclusion that the story of the Protestants of Independent Ireland as a cultural, if not religious minority is drawing to a close. In light of this, hearing the stories of those who still remember a time of marked cultural distinctiveness is important. I thought it was a fantastic way to close the book. It's an absolutely fascinating study of the Protestants of Independent Ireland, and yeah, I'd urge everyone listening, be you Protestant, Catholic or dissenter, or indeed unreconstructed heathen or otherwise, to get a copy of the book. And like you say, there's just to learn more of the nuances and subtleties and complexities of Irish identity and history. And is there anywhere, where can people find you to get copies of the book?
Well, they can get it in all good bookshops in Ireland anyway, and they can get it from the publisher, Eastwood Books.
Eastwood Books?
And yeah.
I'll put a link up in the SoundCloud page for this as well.
And it's on Amazon and places like that as well. But any of the major bookshops in Ireland stock it.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And it's really fascinating, and I'm really glad to have been able just to discuss this I suppose the project, the findings, what it suggests, and also then I suppose let listeners know that all of this material that Deirdre's collected is now happily is going to be bound into the manuscript collections of the manuscript collections of the National Folklore Collection, and is there as a kind of for posterity as a record. So it's a fantastic addition.
That's the last thing I'd like to say. I'd like to say thank you to the National Folklore Collection, because they were so supportive, and all the help I got. And actually, no, sorry, the third final thing I want to say was the people were so excited. The people who took part in this project were so excited and so happy and so proud and thrilled to be in the National Folklore Collection.
Yeah, to be heard.
And Samuel, the gentleman you were discussing early on, I think for him, knowing that his memories were going to be in the National Folklore Collection kind of fixed this problem of him not having been considered back in the school's collection back in 1937 when he was 9 years old.
Yeah, it took a while, but he got there, didn't he?
It took a while, but he got
That
there.
is crazy. He's in the main collection, not the school's collection. That's actually, he must be the only individual maybe who that's happened. I think, a fitting place to end would be with thanks to the Protestant community of Ireland. But thank you so much, Deirdre, for joining us, and I hope everyone out there is taking care, and we'll see you all again. So take care and slán.
Eidlan, Íslands nóg.